So, as many of you will know, we've been dipping in and out of a series on the Gospel of Mark for much of the past year and a half. We're having a clean break from that now. We got to the end of chapter 10, and that was much of the life of Jesus' ministry. And chapter 11 onwards is more about Jesus' journey to the cross, which is really, really important. But we're not going to get through that in the next few weeks. So it's up to you guys as to whether you return back to that at another point. Instead, for now, I'm using the Revised Common Lectionary. I'm going all Anglican. This is an arrangement of 4 weekly Bible readings that are on a 3-year cycle, so year A, B, and C, and they've been really prayerfully curated together, used by many churches and ministers for guiding the passages to be used for a Sunday service. And there's often overlaps and themes that can be found within each week's reading. So I thought that would just be an interesting challenge for me, for us, to really see how God is speaking through those to us in this time. So as I was studying the readings for this coming week, there appeared to be this theme of wisdom emerging from them. And we've already talked a little about wisdom this morning. I asked you to share about someone in your life who has been a wise presence, and it seemed like you had lots to share on that. So, seeing as you've been able to identify wisdom in people you've met, here are pictures of 3 people who you probably haven't met. And it's a question to all of you. Who do you think looks like the most wise person here? You're very welcome to call out. Who do you think looks like the most wise one of these 3? Tracy says, you know what you want me to say, yeah. And what's that one? It's the young lady on the right. So, does anyone know who the young lady on the left is? No? Any guesses? Very well known. Not Florence Nightingale. She's not still alive. She's not Marie Curie. She looked a bit more weathered than this in most photos that we know of her. Not Florence Nightingale. No. So she was quite weathered by the Indian sun. Oh, Mother Teresa. Yes, Mother Teresa. Doesn't look very much like her, does it? That's what life in Calcutta does to you. Hannah and I spent 6 months. You're actually only 21. But at the age of 12, Mother Teresa felt strongly the call of God. She knew that she had to be a missionary to spread the love of Christ. And at the age of 18, she left her parental home in Scotland and joined the Sisters of Loreto, an Irish community of nuns with missions in India. But at the age of 12, Mother Teresa, I don't think she was called Mother Teresa at that point, felt that strong call from God. She was so wise at such a young age. And does anyone know the person on the right of the screen? The lady on the right? No, I'd be surprised if any of you could guess it. Han will know who it is, but this is a person called Cole Arthur Riley, and she is a writer and the creator of Black Liturgies, a project that weaves together prayers and poetry and reflections on the Black experience with Christian faith. And her work often explores themes like justice and dignity and lament and healing, and drawing on the rich tradition of Christian spirituality and the lived experiences of marginalized communities. So much of what she writes and voices oozes deep wisdom, and she's 33. The old man in the middle, does anyone know who that is? That is an AI image that I put in on Microsoft image generator of old man with glasses reading a book. But wisdom is often equated with older people, isn't it? That it's older people who are wise, because wisdom only comes with age and lived experience. And that younger people must listen to their elders because they are wise and they know best. I've certainly met a number of extremely wise older people in my life. And you'll know the kind of people I mean there, where so much of what they say is pure gold. And that it's their lived experience that significantly contributed to that wisdom. It really is true that old people can be very wise. But can I say that every older person I've met is wise? Can all of us say that? Possibly not. Wisdom isn't just a rite of passage. It's not something that you naturally gain with age. It has to be something that you intentionally strive for, something you actively pursue. I've met people in their 40s, in their 30s, in their 20s, and younger who are wise. We often like to label these people as wise beyond their years, which perhaps says more about our perceptions that wisdom only comes with age. Wisdom is something that can be cultivated and developed, not something that simply some people have and some people don't. However, it's also not just a trait or a skill. It's a way of being in the world, a way of living that aligns our hearts, minds, and actions with the divine purposes of God. All of us have the ability and the privilege to cultivate and nurture our wisdom, whatever our age and whatever our stage. True wisdom involves combining the Bible, our individual relationships, and time spent with God, our lived experience, our listening to, and our learning from others. And in this sermon, I'm afraid I can't cover everything there is to do with wisdom, but we can explore these two passages from the Bible that Katie shared with us, Psalm 111 and Ephesians 5:15-20, that both speak of wisdom drawn from God and how it can guide us in our everyday lives. My hope and prayer is that regardless of your age, there's something we can all take from these passages that can enable each of us in our wisdom journeys with God. So let's start with Psalm 111. This is a psalm. This psalm is a hymn of praise. It's structured as an acrostic where each line begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And this literary style is not just a creative choice, but it's a deliberate way to underscore the completeness and order to God's wisdom and works. In the ancient Near Eastern context, wisdom was highly valued, not just among the Israelites, but also surrounding cultures. Wisdom literature like the Proverbs and Job was central to the way people understood life and the world. It wasn't just about abstract knowledge. It was about practical understanding, knowing how to live well, how to make just decisions, how to maintain harmony in the community, and how to honour the divine. Many of the Psalms also speak or express of wisdom as well. So we have this verse at the end of Psalm 111 that we touched on earlier, where it culminates in a powerful declaration. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All those who practice it have a good understanding. His praise endures forever. So in the context of the psalm, fear of the Lord doesn't mean just being afraid of God in the sense of terror or dread. Sometimes we read these verses in the Bible and we think that God is supposed to be terrifying, where we're supposed to really fear God in that way. But instead, this fear of the Lord implies a profound reverence and awe, a respect for God. It's about recognizing God's sovereignty, God's majesty and holiness, and responding with a life oriented around God's purposes. So interpreting this, we might say that wisdom begins with a recognition of the sacredness of life, the interconnectedness of all creation and the divine presence in everything. And this reverence can lead us to live in ways that honour God, respect others, and care for the world around us. It's a wisdom that starts not in fear, but in love. A love for God that spills over into love for our neighbour and creation. So a moment for us to pause and just to ask ourselves the questions of how often do we pause to consider the greatness of God in our daily lives? How does our awareness of the divine shape our decisions and relationships and our actions? True wisdom starts with this reverence, guiding us to live in ways that honour the sacredness of life and creation. Any guesses on where this is?
Ephesus.
Ephesus, yes, that's right. So we're now in Ephesians 5:15 to 20. And this passage was written by Paul, or perhaps a disciple of Paul. Theologians don't really know, they're not too sure. But it is to a community in Ephesus, a bustling city in the Roman Empire known for its cultural and religious diversity. And the early Christians in Ephesus were navigating a really complex world where the pressures to conform to the prevailing culture were really strong. So we have the first verse here where Paul writes, "Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil." In the context of Ephesus, living wisely wasn't just about personal piety. It wasn't about resisting the attraction. It was about resisting the attraction of the surrounding culture that often ran counter to the teachings of Jesus. The days are evil could refer to the moral and the spiritual challenges that the early Christians faced, such as idolatry and injustice and exploitation. So Paul encourages the Ephesians to make the most of the time, a call to live with intentionality and purpose. In a city filled with distractions and competing loyalties, the early Christians were urged to use their time wisely, to seek out what is good, just, and true. For us today, in a world that is incredibly different to this context that the passage was written in, this call to wisdom is still just as relevant. We too live in a complex and challenging society. Some more conservative Christians will just label everything in the world that isn't explicitly Christian as wrong, and that we shouldn't be engaging with or listening to most of secular society. I do think perhaps that is a bit of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Not exactly wise. Earlier in the previous chapter in Ephesians, Paul says, "One God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all." God is in all things. God can be found outside of the church. God can be found anywhere and everywhere. We Christians do not have the monopoly on God. Pastor and theologian Barbara Brown Taylor frequently speaks about finding spiritual wisdom in the ordinary aspects of life. And in her book, An Altar in the World, she writes, "Wisdom does not always come from the mountaintops. Sometimes it comes from the grocery store or in the carpool line." This reflects her belief that spiritual wisdom is accessible in everyday moments and experiences, not just in traditionally sacred spaces, not just in church, or not just in only things or people that are overtly Christian. If we don't draw on the wisdom that can be found in the secular, ordinary world around us, then we're missing out on a whole load of wisdom and a whole load of God. Our gift as Christians is that we have the privilege of recognizing, naming, and choosing to experience life with God. A God who can very much be found outside of the church, the Bible, even in the spooky secular world around us. Living wisely means being aware of the cultural and social forces that shape our lives, identifying and drawing from the spaces and people that are reflecting God's love, and making choices that reflect the values of God's kingdom. It means asking ourselves, how do we use our time, our resources, our influence? Are we aligning our lives with the pursuit of justice, of peace, of love? So what does it mean to live wisely in our time and with our time? What wisdom can we draw from this messy, complex, but beautifully God-soaked world around us? How can we make the most of every opportunity to bring light and love and justice in the world? Living wisely means being aware of the larger context of our actions and striving to make choices that promote the common good, not just the personal gain. So Paul goes on to say, so do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. So in the first century context, understanding God's will was often about navigating the tensions between the new Christian identity and the prevailing pagan practices. It required discernment, an ability to see through the distractions and the deceptions of the world and to choose a path that was aligned with God's purposes. Discerning God's will is an ongoing journey. It's not about finding a single definitive answer, about gauging in a dynamic, evolving relationship with God. It's about being open to the Spirit's leading in new and unexpected ways. God's will is revealed not just in Scripture, but in our experiences, in our communities, and in the world around us. And we need to be listening, like with the earphones there, we need to be listening to God's will that can be found in so many different things and places. This discernment process is deeply rooted in a love for God, love for our neighbour, love for creation. And it calls us to listen, to reflect, and to act in ways that bring healing, justice, and wholeness to the world. So again, just to take stock for a moment, how do we discern God's will in our complex world? How can we ensure that our lives reflect the love and justice of God? Wisdom calls us to a deeper discernment where we listen for God's voice in our hearts, in our communities, and in the cries of those in need, just like that. Paul contrasts being filled with wine, which leads to debauchery, with being filled with the Spirit. And in the context of Ephesus, where the cult of Dionysus promoted ecstatic, wine-fueled rituals, Paul's urge to be filled with the Spirit instead of wine would have been a radical call to a different kind of joy, a joy rooted in the presence of God rather than in the temporary pleasures of the world. For us today, being filled with the Spirit means being open to God's presence in every aspect of our lives, about allowing the Spirit to shape our thoughts and our actions and our relationships. This spiritual filling leads us to live with gratitude, to worship with joy, and to engage with the world in ways that reflect God's love and justice. So, final reflection, how can we open ourselves more fully to the Spirit's work in our lives? How can our community life reflect and nurture the wisdom of God? How can MBC become ever increasingly a place that is known for its spiritual wisdom, both in the young and in the old and in the in-between? Being filled with the Spirit leads us to live not just for ourselves, but for the flourishing of all. So as we reflect on these scriptures, Psalm 111 and Ephesians 5:15-20, we see that wisdom is not just a concept to be admired, but an intentional way of life to be embraced. It begins with a deep reverence for God, a recognition of the sacredness of life, and a commitment to living in alignment with God's purposes. In the ancient world, wisdom was about practical living, making decisions that lead to life and justice and peace. And in our context, wisdom calls us to be mindful of how we live, to use our time well, to seek God's will in all things, and to be filled with the Spirit's presence and power. So as we go into this world this week, let us commit to living wisely. Let us seek God's wisdom in our decisions, our relationships, and our actions. Let us be attentive to the Spirit's guidance, and let us strive to live in ways that bring that healing and that justice, that peace and that hope to all those we encounter. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for your gift of wisdom. Help us to live in ways that are just. Live in ways that seek peace. Live in ways that express the fruits of the Spirit. Lord, may we be constantly seeking to listen to you and who you call us to be and to become. May we not be afraid to gently share that with those around us, not forcefully, not through bringing them down, but through building them up, through gently nurturing them, through sharing from our own lived experience, our own relationship with you, and to help them to experience the fullness of life that you seek to bring to each and every one of us. Lord, help us to be wise. In your name, amen.